Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Miss Education, where we discuss anything and everything we find passion and relevancy in. Today, we're going to have a bit of a different episode, but first, we're going to introduce who's on mic. So, hi, I'm Wyatt. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a senior, and I'm majoring in international studies.
Hi, my name is Kiran. I use she, her pronouns as well. I am a junior majoring in sociology with minors in Arabic and transcultural studies. And yeah.
Awesome. So, we're so excited to have Kiran on mic today. So, today, rather than just exploring a topic like we usually do, we're going to be doing a bit of a discursive and historical analysis of the birth control pill, and specifically the ways in which its creation has been racialized. And we'll go over the general history of the pill, the effects of the racial exploitation in primary trials of the pill, the connection of the credited creator of the pill to the eugenic movement, contemporary racial issues around the pill and contraceptives in general, and what's being done to address these issues today. So, just a little bit of a trigger warning that we are going to be discussing race, racism, racial exploitation, gender based violence, and eugenics. So, as always, take care of yourself if you need to. And all of our sources that we're going to be talking about are going to be linked in the description below.
Yeah. And also, in having this conversation, Wyatt and I really want to acknowledge our own positionality in this. Earlier this semester, we were in a class together, Race, Racialization, and Power. And we talked about the importance of considering our own identities and how they shape how we navigate the world. So in this conversation, we want to acknowledge our own backgrounds, shape how we engage with this context, and these insights that we will be raising are also informed by our own experiences.
Awesome. So we're just going to start with going over some general history around the pill. So according to the Planned Parenthood fact sheet on the history of the pill, which can be found on their website, the woman who was credited with the creation of the birth control pill is Margret Sanger, and Sanger was the founder of the American Birth Control League, which was a predecessor of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in America, or in the United States, in 1916, and she also was the honorary president and chair of Planned Parenthood, and she drove the research and development of the pill well into her 70s. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, Sanger personally funded some of the research into the pill, but the involvement of Catherine Dexter McCormick, who was Sanger's longtime friend and women's rights activist, she really kicked off this research movement into the pill through her funding. And she also funded the initial trials of the pill, which were held in Puerto Rico, which is something we're going to dive into later, which was conducted by Dr. John Rock, gynecologist and Roman Catholic. And on June 23rd, 1960, the FDA approved the first pill, which is called Enovid, for use as an oral contraceptive. But it was very difficult for women to gain access to it. And in 1965, Planned Parenthood won the Supreme Court case, Griswold versus Connecticut, which rolled back state laws that had outlawed the use of contraception by married couples. So then by 1965, 1 in 4 married women in the US under the age of 45 had used the pill, and by 1967, nearly 13 million in the world were using it, which increased to 50 to 80 million in 1984 and 100 million in the world today. And that's not just Enovid. There are a couple different types of the birth control pill today.
Yeah, and access to birth control pill has so many health benefits. When used as directed, only 3 out of 1,000 women will become pregnant in the first year of use, and only about 9 out of 100 will become pregnant in the first year of use with less consistent usage. It can also help reduce the symptoms of, I'm always going to say this word wrong, endometriosis. Yeah, thank you. Decreases chances of asymptomatic pregnancy, less menstrual flow and cramping, reduce acne, reduce bone thinning, reduce iron deficiency, anemia related to menstruation, reduce risk of ovarian and endometrium cancers, and shorter and more regulated periods. So that's a lot, like just right there.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think it's always important to remember that like women don't only take the pill, or people with uteruses don't only take the pill just to prevent pregnancy, but there's a ton of other health benefits too. So while the pill has all these health benefits and has been incredibly effective as a form of pregnancy prevention, it's also important to understand the racialized history of the pill as well. So we're going to delve into that a little bit.
Yeah, so starting with the founder herself and her history with birth control. Angela Davis actually describes this in her piece, Racism, Birth Control, and Reproductive Rights. She writes, she describes Margaret Sanger's relationship as Margaret Sanger's birth control crusade. And though she's often been praised for her work, she also does have a violent history with eugenics.
Yeah, and so real quick, just to note some of the jargon used, could you just explain what eugenics is?
Yeah, of course. So eugenics is rooted in English upper class beliefs about passing down superior traits, which I don't know about you, but kind of just sounds to me like a way of like justifying the ruling
Right,
class.
right.
Um,
Totally.
yeah, and I don't know, but biological determinants for success kind of feel gross. But like,
Yeah.
anyways, yeah. In the U.S., eugenics can be divided into two categories. So those who want to promote childbearing for the fit classes, and I'm putting quotation marks around fit, and the suppression of those with also quotation marks inferior stock.
Mhm.
To be honest, I don't know if that's two different classes, categories. It also seems like racism for both, but just different ways of saying it, you know? Um, yeah, in the United States, states enacted sterilization laws as early as 1907, and they used these to forcibly sterilize over 64,000 people. And even Hitler turned to states like California because of their usage of sterilization eugenics,
Mhm.
um, which is pretty wild.
Not great.
Um, yeah. So, and then it also raises the question of what undesirable traits were there? Like, what were they trying to breed out of society? And these were things like mental disability, criminality, and promiscuity, and these are also all terms we can problematize and like look
Right.
further into. But I think especially around promiscuity, that really has a really interesting conversation with our conversation around contraceptives. Yeah, so it obviously has a really, really deep history in the United States. It has been used in some pretty problematic ways.
Mhm.
So first, let's consider the narratives around Sanger's history. Despite quotes like "enforced motherhood is the most complete denial of a woman's rights to life and liberty," which is in her 1914 article, and another quote in her 1920 statement, which said, "Enforced motherhood is a complete denial of women's rights to life and liberty," and then another quote um, where she said, "I consider the world and almost our civilization for the next 25 years is going to depend on a simple, cheap, safe contraceptive to be used in poverty-stricken slums, jungles, and among the most ignorant people." Her support for eugenics is still contested.
Right. And so, notably, Gloria Steinman, in her 1998 essay, actually defended Sanger's connection with eugenics. And this is kind of used a lot in this controversy around whether Sanger was a supporter of the eugenics movement or not. She said that it was basically a political move to widen appeal and access to birth control. And at the national level, the Planned Parenthood Federation in America has released multiple fact sheets defending Margaret Sanger, and they have stressed her connection to Black leaders such as Du Bois, Powell, and King, cited Nazis that banned her book, and have condemned but contextualized, in quotes, her speech to the KKK in Silver Lake, New York, which is also used against her a lot. And it's important to note that this isn't nationwide, though, this like defense of her by Planned Parenthood. Because she is so connected to Planned Parenthood. That's kind of like a running theme through this podcast is kind of discussion around Planned Parenthood. Um, so though the Planned Parenthood Federation in America has released fact sheets like that just in 2020, the Planned Parenthood of Greater New York removed Margaret Sanger's name from the Manhattan health clinics. And according to them, from an article, this is, to quote, Planned Parenthood contributions to historical reproductive harm within communities of color, end quote. And that's from Karen Seltzer, who's the chair of the NY Affiliates Board. And the New York Planned Parenthood takes this step not to necessarily like cancel Sanger, but to like reckon with the history that she has.
Yeah, and this acknowledgement of harm from the New York Planned Parenthood feels a lot different from the Federation's response to Margaret Sanger.
For sure.
Yeah, and the case of Margaret Sanger also raises questions of how we understand our histories, how we acknowledge harm, and even an article we read for our class, which was called "A Theory of Racialized Organization" by Victor Ray. Um, Part of understanding Sanger's history is understanding that organizations like Planned Parenthood, as well as fields such as public health, aren't race neutral. Much
Yeah.
of public health, like Planned Parenthood's defense of Sanger, act as if they were, like especially at the
Yeah.
Federation's level. And then one example of this is in 2016. In a 2016 fact sheet, they wrote, Sanger's passion to spread mainstream birth control led to her speak to any group interested in learning how to plan reproduction. And this is referencing her speech to the KKK.
Right.
So that kind of assumes that the speech to the KKK could be considered the same as any other speech. This ignores race, history, power, honestly, it's irresponsible, inaccurate, and potentially harm. It's a potentially harmful assumption to make, and one that can cause further harm. In New
Right.
York,
It kind of feels like a way for Planned Parenthood to like, just like a bit of a defensive move.
yeah, it doesn't feel very honest or very
Yeah.
transparent.
Yeah.
But that kind of contrasts with like New York Planned Parenthood's removal of her
Mhm.
name, because they're starting to take steps towards naming the harms they've caused.
Right.
And like also in doing that, there in acknowledging harm, there's the importance to acknowledge those and center those who are doing the work. So while Planned Parenthood of New York was removing Sanger's name in 2020, it's important to note that Black women are the ones who've been talking about the violence eugenics.
Right.
There's one notable essay by Toni Cade in 1969, which is called The Pill, Genocide or Liberation, in which she invokes the intersectional approach to understanding the sexist and racist potential discourse around birth control. She writes, it was really, really interesting. She writes about how the pill alone doesn't liberate, but can offer control over one's own life.
Mhm.
Um, and, on that point, but whether or not Margaret Sanger was cool with eugenics or not, like what did she actually do? And kind of like the rest of our conversation, it's complicated and
Right.
contested. I guess that's how history is. But
Mhm.
so I guess kind of on that point, then what is being said about Sanger's promotion of birth control in Black and immigrant communities? And while many will point to Sanger's own quotes for answers like this, some argue that Sanger was trying to help Black and immigrant communities. Ellen Chesler, the author of the autobiography of Sanger, argues that Sanger thought Black and immigrant children would be better off if only their parents had smaller families.
Right, and that sounds super similar to the Moynihan report, something we also talked about in our class. Which very similarly to the report, this argument puts kind of the blame on Black and immigrant families, and particularly mothers, for systemic oppression. And it feels paternalistic in the way that it invokes children as a justification and feels pretty savioristic in the positioning as Sanger as this like benevolent savior to poor Black and immigrant children. And it ignores the historical violence of the United States through sterilization, imperialism, chattel slavery, and ignores all that to say if Black and immigrant families were smaller, then they would be better off. So in many ways, even the argument that Chester claims like feels off in a lot of ways too.
Yeah, it definitely does. And we know that's a lot to take in, but there's another contentious issue that we should be discussing, and that's the Puerto Rico pill trials with Dr. Rock. So Dr. John Rock, also mentioned earlier, was seen as a co-developer of the first birth control pill. He also worked alongside Gregory Pincus, a biologist and researcher. Both of these guys together attempted to conduct a trial in his state of Massachusetts, but because prescribing the pill and giving out information on contraceptives was illegal at the time, they had to find another place to do it or be fined $1,000 every time he and his staff gave a pill or information about it to any woman in the trial, or they would have to spend 5 years in prison.
Right.
So basically, they're like, we're not doing this.
I'll find somewhere else.
Um, yeah, and so Rock and Pincus and their team considered New York, Mexico, Japan, Hawaii, and India before deciding on Puerto Rico. According to Planned Parenthood, they decided on Puerto Rico for several reasons. Because it was close to the U.S., so their team could travel back and forth easily. There were no laws against using contraceptives. Many practitioners were trained in the U.S. Many women were semi-literate or literate, so they could test whether or not the pill was being used by any woman in the world, regardless of literacy. There's a stable population, so women could be followed throughout the entirety of the trial. It had well-established networks of birth control clinics, and many women were eager to have access to contraceptives. The women in the trial had to meet four criteria. They had to have at least two children to prove that they're fertile. They had to be in good health. They had to promise to bring the child to term if they were to get pregnant, and they had to be under 40. So Planned Parenthood does admit to the fact that by today's standards, many of the women did not sign up to this trial with informed consent of what they were agreeing to. But as they say, before the FDA, this is a quote from them, before the FDA approved the pill in 1960s, 221 women in Puerto Rico had taken it in two clinical trials. More than 130 of them had used it for between 1 and 3 years. Thousands more in Australia, Britain, Ceylon, Chicago, Haiti, Hong Kong, Japan, Los Angeles, Mexico City, Seattle, and Tennessee were involved in clinical trials of various formulations of the pill. Another 500,000 women had used the first brand and avoid for up to 3 years for menstrual regulation. And by the end, Sarah Lee submitted reports on only 897 women in its application for FDA approval, end quote.
Yeah, so this statement kind of shows like, they used so many different women for this trial. Like, see, it wasn't just Puerto Rico, kind of. But it really glosses over the fact that in the end, Puerto Rican women were really used as guinea pigs in the first big trial that for this pill that had never been used by any other women. So that was Enovid, like we were saying. And this is super interesting. But so the first Enovid pill had 10,000 micrograms of progestin and 150 milligrams or micrograms of estrogen. In comparison to today's pills, they are more likely to contain 50 to 150 micrograms of progestin and 20 to 50 micrograms of estrogen. So it went from 10,000 micrograms of progestin to 50 to 150 micrograms, which is pretty insane to me. And what Planned Parenthood also leaves out in that is that many of the birth control clinics that were run in Puerto Rico, which is one of the reasons that they cited as for why they chose to go to Puerto Rico, those were set up by a eugenicist named Clarence Gamble, who saw birth control as a way to eliminate poverty in Puerto Rico. And Gamble is noted for supporting policies that encourage women to undergo sterilization that ultimately led to 1/3 of Puerto Rican women becoming sterilized after their second child, many times involuntarily. And according to an article published by the History Channel, these centers became a recruiting center for the pill trials, like we talked about. So while more highly educated women didn't want to engage in the trial because of unknown side effects, poor women who were desperate to avoid sterilization and pregnancy were recruited beginning in 1955. And according to the same article, women who engaged in the trial, they didn't know that it was experimental, they didn't know it had potential side effects, and they didn't even know that they were part of a trial at all. So some of the potential side effects that they weren't aware of were things like dizziness, nausea, blood clots, headaches, vomiting, and 25 women withdrew from the trial because the side effects were so uncomfortable. And there were even rare but serious side effects such as heart attacks and strokes, and one woman even died of congestive heart failure, and another developed pulmonary tuberculosis. And despite these side effects, Enovid was still the first pill to be approved by the FDA in 1960, but the lack of transparency about the women that were first used to test this pill, I think, is like really telling that these women were poor and uneducated and desperate because they were trying to avoid sterilization by this U.S. eugenicist who had come to Puerto Rico to sterilize a bunch of poor and uneducated Puerto Rican women. They weren't given truthful information about their involvement in an experiment trial, nor were they informed about the possible harmful side effects. And they were also recruited, through these birth control centers that were explicitly set up by a eugenicist to attempt to deplete a community that he saw as, quote, unfit, end quote. And this exploitation of poor Latino women in Puerto Rico is one of the countless examples of Black and brown bodies being used as test subjects in the field of reproductive health. So another example we could go into would be something like the Tuskegee syphilis study, and we're not going to get into it right now. But brushing off this exploitation by saying that, like, oh, it was just a different time and like the ethical component of studies weren't really seen as necessary then, I kind of think is a little bit of some BS because, like, sure, the IRB hadn't been set up yet, but I don't think that you shouldn't need a review board to tell you that exploiting the bodies of women who are unable to advocate for themselves, that like that isn't okay.
Yeah, yeah. And that was a lot of history.
Right.
And as we know, history lives on today. History isn't just in the past, but it informs the present. So let's talk about what's happening now. And right now, so one thing that's pretty ironic, given the history of like women of color being the test subjects for contraceptives, is that today, according to a 2011 study entitled "Disparities in Family Planning," and this is a quote from them: approximately half of all sexually active women of reproductive age are estimated to be in need of publicly funded services, and only 50% of them are served under the current system. As low socioeconomic and minority women are disproportionately uninsured in the U.S., women with no insurance coverage are less than 30% less likely to use prescription contraceptives. Lack of insurance coverage for contraception is likely contributor to disparities in unintended pregnancies. End quote. And then another quote is, and there is evidence that minority and low socioeconomic status women do experience disparities in care, with Black and Hispanic women and women with lower levels of education having been found to rate their family planning visits less positively. Based on this, we can see that there is a discrepancy based on race and class in terms of access to care.
Right, which is like pretty ironic because it's like they were using poor black and brown women to like get all these trials and like pills and stuff passed, and then now they're underserved in the current system for the same things. But then also in the same study, they reported that, quote, a study of patient experiences with medical care during pregnancy found that low-income Black and Latino women were more likely to report being encouraged to limit their family size than middle-class whites, and a survey of family planning clients found that Black women were more likely to report being pressured to start a contraceptive method than whites. In a survey of Black women, 28% reported that they had been encouraged to use one form of birth control when they preferred another, and 67% reported that they had experienced race-based discrimination when obtaining family planning services. An analysis of the National Survey of Family Growth also indicated that Black and Hispanic women were more likely to report having received counseling about birth control than white women, and that Hispanic women were more likely to be counseled about sterilization. So these statistics, they have similar vibes to that of the discussion of eugenics that we had earlier, and show that these mindsets like haven't really left the medical industry. So it's like, one, it's harder to access that care for these women, but then at the same time, when they do access that care, they're pushed into directions they don't want to go into, or they're pushed to like keep their families small or look towards sterilization, when for a lot of other women, like sterilization is actually really hard to get. So it's just kind of interesting to think of like how today even a lot of these same kind of like pretty much, like, I would kinda consider them, I don't know what you think of, kinda like eugenics mindsets are still, like,
Yeah,
pretty prominent in the medical industry, and I think that that's, yeah, pretty significant to point out that this is not just something from the 1960s, but that it's still, like, carrying on over to today.
absolutely. And I think it's important too to understand, like, in this conversation, like we're citing a lot of like, academic texts and a lot of like these conversations on these studies, but even existing literature, media coverage, and like popular discourse, like academia doesn't necessarily equate justice, like
Mhm,
what's being said about these topics and how they're being talked about and how they're being studied isn't necessarily neutral either.
mhm,
And as we report our research and thoughts, we encourage the audience to problematize our language, our sources, and our ideas. Like, what are we missing? Who are we centering? How can we improve? Because much of what is being discussed is a conversation around bodies and whose bodies get valued. Thinking about categorizations and value, we're aware that like socially constructions are popularly used in academia, both as truth and as something to problematize. And we want to be cautious of inadvertently normalizing harm. So we encourage our audience to question even what we're offering. And I think that's really important to
yeah,
how
for
we
sure.
study this topic.
Yeah, definitely. So now it's kind of a question of like, where do we go from here? Like, there's a lot and many things that the two of us have failed to mention, and what we've listed is really limited, because this is conversation is bigger and it's deeper than just the things that we've discussed. And there's a lot that we're not considering. For example, we've had minimal transnational and religious analysis included in this. And we also want to practice acknowledging the harms. So, are there ways we can approach the pill that are trauma informed? How does this show up in our marketing, conversations, and education around the pill? Birth control has been called, quote, race suicide, end quote, but are there ways that the pill can be reclaimed?
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like, how can we reclaim the pill?
Right.
And can we?
Hmm.
Um, and also thinking about how sex is criminalized and shamed. Like, how does the pill offer autonomy? I think that kind of goes to that question as well. And thinking about authors like Adrienne Mew Brown, like how can the pill be part of pleasure activism? And
Hmm.
also, like as you said earlier, like all the non-sex related benefits of the pill. How do we consider all that in this conversation? And then also like how do we think about? And I think you kind of mentioned this earlier about how it kind of like shows up again, but how do we think about like internalized eugenic assumptions? How do we understand the idea of defect, which is so tied to disability, criminality, and promiscuity, and how does that show up today
Hmm.
in our society, in our relationships, and like also with ourselves? And as you said, like when we're talking about New York and the Federation for Planned Parenthood, like part of reckoning with the history of the pill is reckoning with ourselves and looking inward.
Right. And I think that this makes it difficult because in no way are we trying to be like, the pill is terrible, don't take the pill, right? Like, I've
Yeah.
taken the pill for 7 years, like, there are so many great benefits to having this access to not just the birth control pill, but like birth control and like contraceptives in general that have allowed women to like have so much autonomy and like be able to do so many things that they weren't able to do before it. But yeah, it's just this kind of question of like, okay, but the history of it is still important and it still affects, how we act and behave today. So that those conversations like need to be at the forefront as well and need to be, known about, and especially by like healthcare professionals who are the people like advising these people with uteruses on what to do with their bodies and how to like best care for themselves and their families.
Absolutely,
So,
because sorry, like I just think it's like
oh, yeah.
like the pill is such a like individual conversation, but it's so collective as well. As you just said, like it's
Mhm.
our individual choices and it's public health and more.
Right, and especially once you start to look at things like abortion and just like a bunch of things within reproductive healthcare, it just turns into a really huge conversation. So definitely consider these questions. Right. So we've definitely laid some pretty intense questions and thoughts out there for you all to consider. But we're going to end this podcast by talking about some organizations that are talking about contraceptives in culturally sensitive and trauma-informed ways.
So first of all, there's Heart Women and Girls. They go by Heart now. They're an organization dedicated to ensuring that Muslims have the resources, language, and choice to nurture sexual health and confront sexual violence so that all people, including Muslims, are free of sexual violence and can thrive in communities where they live, work, and pray in. Super dope.
Yeah, and next we have Advocates for Youth, which is an organization dating back to 1980 that has worked with youth leaders to ensure that all young people's rights are respected and that they have the tools that they need to protect themselves against STIs, HIV, and unintended pregnancies. And they highly value the fact that reproductive and sexual health and rights are inextricably linked to social justice and the fight for liberation. And also, despite its contentious history, which we know we've kind of like sounded like we've really bashed on Planned Parenthood in this podcast, but that's just because we think it's really important to include that transparency. But they are a leader in providing accessible and high quality reproductive health care to millions of women worldwide, or people worldwide, and families. And they are also involved in advocating for policies that make reproductive health care, sex education, and information more accessible to everyone. So we just want to say, like, we don't hate Planned Parenthood or anything like that. We think they do a lot of awesome work, but it's just important to also like acknowledge the history behind it in a transparent and honest way.
Yeah. And exactly, yeah. And then some other notable organizations that we won't read their whole bios, but you're more than welcome to look them up. These include Sister Song, Black Women's Health Imperative, National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, Unite. I'm really Asian. I couldn't even get that right myself. Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity, National Women's Health Network, and the National Network of Abortion Funds. So these are all some other organizations you can check out doing some work around reproductive justice.
Yeah. Awesome. So, okay, we know we covered a lot in this podcast pretty quickly, and some of it was pretty heavy, but acknowledging the ways in which racialization, racism, and power dynamics have played a role in the history of reproductive care, and in particular the creation of the pill, is just the first step in creating more equitable access to care that provides people with what they want for themselves and their families, and not just what others see as fit for them. And we encourage you all to sit with any discomfort and to take care of yourselves, especially right now, and also to appreciate all the work done by Black and Latina, Indigenous, and all people, and particularly women who have fought for reproductive justice. And as usual, we would like to say thanks so much for tuning into Miseducation, and please check out the links below for more information. All of the things that we talked about will be linked. And we would like to thank our amazing co-host, Kiran. Yay. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for
And
having me. This was super dope.
And our wonderful editor, Isabel Thompson. And for more from Her Campus AU, follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Her Campus AU to keep up to date with Miseducation, and check out AU Her Campus articles on the Her Campus page under the American University tab. All right. Thanks, you guys.
Thank
Hope you all have a great day. Bye.
Bye.